bilingualism and multilingualism. As you can see, I will be using these two terms somewhat interchangeably. Um, I first thought that I would be talking only about one or the other, but then I realized that these two terms are overlapping a lot, and we actually have to talk about them together. Um, the outline of the talk would be, well, first we will be talking about the definitions, right? What do we mean by these two, multilingualism and bilingualism? Then we will talk a little bit about the features of them, and I will dedicate a lot of the talk just talking and presenting all the different types and classifications of multilingualism and bilingualism, just to actually accentuate how complicated it is to give a definition in the first place. And we are still in psycholinguistics and in linguistics struggling to, we have to put a lot of effort into explaining why we mean by bilingualism or multilingualism when we say it. Then I will talk a little bit about multilingual language acquisition, and at the end I will mention um, of the some of the language processing models um, that have to do with how multilingual or bilingual brain processes these two languages, without going too much into neuroscience, more from a psycholinguistic point of view. So definitions. What is multilingualism? Multilingualism is, broadly speaking, a use of more than one language, right? Either by an individual speaker or by a group of speakers. But then when we say bilingualism, we are talking about bilingual individuals. That is somebody who speaks two languages. Somebody who speaks two languages is a very, very broad and vague definition, as we will see. Nowadays, everybody speaks at least two languages, right? But in a way, according to these definitions, bilingualism is then a subset or a more concrete scenario within multilingualism, right? Um, so I will often be talking about bilingualism because most of our studies are based on focusing on the two languages. But very often you will see in those studies that the participants do not just speak two languages, they also have other languages. Um, so there are many different, as I call them here, shades of multilingualism. And we can divide and classify different scenarios and different profiles of bilinguals depending on two very important factors. One is the timing on of each of the languages being acquired or learned, and the other one is the sequence. What was the order of acquiring these languages? So how, in what sequence, and when? In general, as I will explain further, you can have more than one native language as mother tongue. This is when you acquire from birth and then you're simultaneous, for example. But then you can learn or acquire two languages at a different point, and then you're a sequential bilingual. So this is what I mean by different sequences, right? Sorry, it's not okay. Okay. So based on sequence and timing, we can say, first of all, based on timing, we can distinguish between early bilinguals and late bilinguals. So for example, I am a late bilingual because I acquired English. I started learning English after when I was 7 or 8, right? But my friend who is Serbian and she has a Portuguese partner, their child will be early bilingual because the child will acquire two languages from birth. Early, right? When we say early in linguistics and early childhood, we basically mean before school. So between the age 6 or 7, right? So early bilingualism is the acquisition of more or two languages at this early childhood, right? Before the child starts going to school. And if you remember from the previous, my previous talks from language acquisition, a very important factor in this is not just when, but also that the environment provides exposure in both of these languages, right? So, for example, the environment is bilingual. A good example is the Basque Country, for example, where everything is in Basque and Spanish. So, young children who grow up in these environments where they have frequent and sufficient use and exposure to both languages are these true early bilinguals, right? And there is constant exposure to them. You can already see here that we can have early bilinguals of many different types already here. This scenario where you have equal exposure to both languages is not very common. Sometimes you have child exposed early to two languages, but one of them would be present, only one would be present in the environment, for example, because a child lives in a I don't know, Spanish speaking country, but to another one the child is being exposed only within the family, right? So here, although both of them are acquired early, the exposure is different, right? I will talk a little bit more about the context in a bit. Now, when the child acquires like several languages early, two or more, right? All this can be applied to three languages, to four languages. It's just it really rarely occurs. So we usually, and all the studies usually study, the scenarios that are accessible. So we are talking about bilingualism mostly. Simultaneous early bilingualism is when you is again this ideal situation where you have these multiple languages and you're learning them simultaneously in your all of your environments, right? You're using both languages for everything, for all situations, both to talking to your family, to talking to your friends, and in school and everywhere, right? And then you have actually the strongest language skill in both languages. Consecutive or successive bilingualism, that's when the child also acquires both languages early, but one after another, right? Now, there might be some differences. This is the scenario where you can have one language at home, for example, and the other one at school, right? Depending on where you live, what the social situation is. Um, and in those cases, the children also acquire very strong knowledge because it's early bilingualism. However, there might be some differences when it comes to different scenarios and contexts. So the child might have, say, stronger vocabulary for academic and school related vocabulary in one language, and in, I don't know, food and animals, because that's what you learned at home, in the other language. But these are all early. Then you can have late bilingualism. That is when you acquire or learn a second language after the age of 6 or 7, right? And this is usually happening in adolescence or adulthood. These are usually the languages that we start learning as foreign languages at school. Um, and it's a different scenario because you are instructed and it's not acquired within your, let's say, environment with your friends or with your family. Yeah, as I said here, it's usually motivated by an academic or a professional need. So this is usually what we mean by early and late. Second, it's a little bit. And then a unicorn example here would be a perfectly balanced bilingual, right? A balanced bilingual would be this early simultaneous bilingual who lives in an environment um, where they were early exposed to multiple languages equally, right? Um, whereas where you can use both of languages for all the situations. This is a very, it's called ideal bilingual because it doesn't happen often. Whereas unbalanced bilinguals are usually not equally proficient in both languages. Mind you that unbalanced bilinguals can be both early and late. It depends, because although the children might acquire the other language early, they might not be exposed to it, or they might stop using the other one for some reason. And in that case, the speakers have one dominant language that we call the first language, or L1, language one. If you see in the presentation L1, L2, it's usually L1 is the first language, L2 is the second language. But there are also different contexts also within which languages are acquired. So there's something called compound bilingual, where you can have two language systems within a single context, right? Um, and this is again with these balanced bilinguals, where you have, you grow up in bilingual environment, you have both of your languages at home, you have bilingual education. So both languages are present everywhere. And you use both of them in your day-to-day life. Coordinate is when you use one language in one context, the other one in another. And subcoordinate is something that is usually referred to in late bilingualism, when we kind of have our mother tongue and then later we acquire in a usually academic context another language, and it is believed that we usually filter through the mother tongue when we learn the other one, and we always compare. Also, the context of language acquisition can be divided to informal settings, when you would acquire the language outside of formal settings like school. So, for example, the teenagers learning English through online video games or YouTube and such. That would be an informal way to acquire language, or maybe having some pen friends. Whereas the formal way to learn a language is in school or through some kind of formal instruction. And this is a table that I took, that is adapted from Way 2000, just to show you how many more different types and profiles of bilinguals we have depending on different factors. Um, Early, diagonal, covert, bilingual, secondary bilingual, natural bilingual, minimal. So there are many, many terms. So this is why it is hard, and probably there are no two bilinguals that are the same, right? There is always a factor that is stronger in one bilingual and weaker in the other bilingual that might determine the difference between the two languages or the balance between the two languages, right? When it comes to the societies, it usually happens um, that you have a multilingual society or a nation, and that everybody is multilingual within it, right? However, it might happen that one language has a certain connotation of, say, social or political power, um, and then the other language could be called minority language, the other one being majority language. This is also important to take into consideration. Also, one language might be used for different languages can be used for different registers, right? For example, one language might be used for official purposes in school, in formal context, and the other language might be used in informal context to talk to your friends, etc. But it's very rare to have a multilingual community where speakers are monolingual in each of three languages, right? It is possible to have certain, I mean, this would have to, it requires some sort of isolation from each other, right? There are parts of countries where the region is multilingual, and then you have certain areas where people are usually dominant in different languages, right? From the north of Serbia, where I come from, Serbian is the official language. However, we have certain villages and certain regions where people are dominant in Hungarian, where people are dominant in Slovak, where people are dominant in Romani, but they're usually also speak Serbian because it's the official language, but they're nevertheless dominant in the other language. So we can have different situations, and this also determines the type of bilingual you are. And very importantly, nowadays, bilingualism or multilingualism is triggered by migrations, right? This is another type of situation. So what happens in those situations is your mother tongue is called then the heritage language, right? then usually those people have their heritage language and the language spoken in the place of residence or the country that they live. This is a different situation because then you will keep talking your heritage language only maybe within your household or if you know other families that speak it. But the dominant language of the community and the society is a different one. This is also very common among previously colonized countries, that there is one language brought by the colonies, and then you have the native language. Usually, also different languages are used in different situations. And also, there is something that happens because language is, like a living thing, as we say. It is changing. It is not stuck. It changes as people use it, and it's under influences of other languages too, and of other things that are happening in the society. So what happens very often is that the neighboring countries often experience this kind of cultural exchange, and with it goes also the language exchange, and this is a very natural and, let's say, organic way, um, which leads to, usually in the borders or near the borders of the countries, you have multilingual communities that speak both the language of the country and of the neighboring country. And this is great, right? In the end, the important thing to remember here is that knowing more languages and being bilingual is a good thing. I mean, it only adds richness, right, to your existence. Um, when it comes to bilingual language acquisition, I'm going to move now to that. You might remember a little bit if some of you came to the previous class where I talked about it. Um, well, what is multilingual language acquisition? It refers to acquiring two languages together. This is a very important topic because there are a lot of myths and misconceptions that come with bilingual acquisition and therefore bilingual education, right? Um, the misconceptions are usually centered around the conception that a young child is being overloaded by with too many languages, and that might hinder their overall not just linguistic skills, which is not the main thing, but the general academic skills, that they might underperform in, say, maths, if you are, mixing languages. But what the research shows is actually the contrary. The research shows that bilingual children actually acquire the same proficiency, phonological, grammatical, everything of their two languages as monolingual children do. So, but as I mentioned again, exposure is very substantial. So, if you expose the children more, it is only better for them. And this is a very important piece of information for bilingual education, that is pro bilingual education, because if children are exposed to more than one language in school, of course, if it makes sense within a given environment, within a given society, but if they're exposed to them in school too, it can only be good for them when it comes to how well they will acquire these two languages. Giving preference to any language will result, of course, in a stronger development of that language, because a lot of it boils down to exposure, right? And as I said previously, according to research, the children who learn two languages simultaneously, so we're talking about simultaneous bilinguals here, go through the same processes and progress as children who learn only one language. There might be, I also talked in the previous talk about the milestones. When we acquire language, we have certain milestones. Say around the month 6, you start babbling. Then by the age of 1, you start producing your first words that have meaning. Then by 18th month, you start combining words, or 2 years. So the milestones in terms of how they are ordered, what is the order of the development of the language, is the same with the bilinguals too, in both of their languages. However, what might happen is that there is with the bilinguals some delay. either in one language or the other. And why is that? Well, because they have a bigger span to learn, simply speaking, right? If a monolingual child learns 100 vocabulary items, that means that a bilingual has to learn 200 vocabulary items for the same number of concepts, right? So it is simply a matter somehow when, when the parents are concerned about whether their child will acquire both languages. It's a matter of patience and just providing enough exposure to both languages. And usually, by the time the kids go to school, things are fixed, right? And they acquire both languages equally, if given again enough exposure, right? As I also mentioned, well, learning a second language, which is also, against this myth that the children will be confused. Learning a second language or a third or fourth is much easier for a child than for a grown adult, because a young child's brain is more prone or more able to absorb all that information. I talked also last time about the critical period hypothesis and about brain plasticity, which in short um, boils down to our brain being able to adapt and use those neurons and create those synapses that you need, and basically get rid of those that you don't need in the first period of life. In the first, say, 7 years or so of our lives, our brains are basically being molded. This is mostly referring to the white matter, the white brain matter. So our brains are basically being molded towards what we will need later in life. So this is why a lot of researchers suggest to expose children to whatever whatever skill you can within their first several years of life, because this is when the brains are adapting. This is when the brains are very, very receptive to new information, and will those paths that are created then, and those neural pathways that are created then, will be much stronger than those created later in life. um, Again, exposure to a language enables children to naturally learn or understand language. I mean, again, just the fact that children are acquiring language without any formal instruction is incredible. So we should not be very concerned that the children will be confused. Their brains are amazing at learning languages. So it takes far less effort for a young child than it might take for a fully adult brain. If we are teaching a second language at an early age, that's generally considered nowadays to be a good thing. And this is a nice paper, uh, because I'm not an expert in this, so I think that this is a nice paper to refer you to if you are interested in these issues about should my child be learning more languages from birth. Um, and it's based on the actual, what the science says. It's sort of aimed at busting the myths around multilingual acquisition and education. And nowadays, the countries are actually listening to science more, and they're, countries with the multilingual societies or bilingual societies are creating education programs so that it reflects more what the science says, and are more open to multilingual or bilingual education, which I think is great. Um, yes, this is yes. Another thing is that although bilingual or multilingual children can acquire both languages, some mixing might occur, right? For example, they sometimes start a sentence with one language, finish with another. This is fine. It's part of bilingual development. This is how they are. This is how they learn. Um, this is simply because they won't have the equal vocabularies in both languages always, right? For example, they know a certain word in one language but not in the other. Um, and this confusing of the two languages happens less and less. However, this is not to be mixed with the other thing that is called language switching, Language switching is different from language mixing. And language switching is something that grown adults also do, which is consciously switching from one language to another within the same sentence, right? For me, I mean, this is something that happens quite often in with balanced bilinguals in multilingual societies. But bilinguals and multilinguals are very good, and children are very good at it too. To know when they're talking to somebody, and there's a lot of research done on this, they won't, get confused and talk to a person in English when they know that this person is, a Spanish speaker, right? So they know exactly that, say, grandma speaks English. This friend of mine is bilingual, speaks both Spanish and English, and mommy speaks only English, right? And they're good at it. They learn with whom to speak in what language and with whom they can switch. So when they know that the person that they are addressing, both children and adults do this, is multilingual and bilingual in the same languages as they are, language switching happens often, which means using a word or a phrase of another language in the middle of the speaking the first language. And this is fine. This happens consciously. People can stop it or not do it. For example, if they have to perform, or if they have to write an essay in school, they won't do it. For me, I don't think this is a confusion, and I don't think it's a problem. I think it's, showing how, adding richness, because maybe at some point you think that the other language has a more suitable term for something that you're talking about. So I think this is why I think knowing more languages is valuable. There is another thing that might happen though, which is the opposite of learning a language, and that is losing a language. And this is called language attrition. This is again going to show uh, how bilingual you are, how dominant you are in one of the languages that you speak, really depends on the exposure and your particular situation, right? So some people can use their first language, their native language, after they have acquired a second language. And this um, sometimes happens when the second language interferes with the first one. And usually this happens when you move countries, right? And you are isolated from the speakers of the first language. So it's simply a matter of the lack of practice and exposure. This rarely happens, honestly. It is really hard to forget your mother tongue, but there are studies on children who are adopted and who are, on an international level. And even a 9-year old, which is already, past the critical period, it's not, it's not considered early childhood. There are cases showing that they can almost completely forget their first language when they are completely removed from the country of birth, and their first language, and they're not using it anymore. I should also add that in cases like this, there's an emotional factor added too, right? So the forgetting your first language and being more motivated to learn the new language in the new family that adopted you is completely makes sense from a psychological point of view. So as I said, language attrition happens. It usually rarely happens that you completely forget, but what happens often is that you forget a little bit, because you are, or you become less fluent, or less, you need more time to remember certain words or phrases in your first language, simply because you are using the second one more, right? Okay, so we're talking about bilingualism and multilingualism. Um, and why I think it's an important topic, and why I chose this topic for today, is because, monolingualism is actually a very rare thing in the 21st century. It doesn't exist that much. In this study by Bialystok, who is a very important researcher in the fields of bilingualism, they say that it is not, it's not just common, it's the majority of population, right? So if we say there are 6,700 languages around, 6,700 languages in the world, and 200 nation states, that means that in those 200 states we must have states with several languages, right? With multiple languages. And that over 70% of world languages are found in only 20 states, right? So the concentration of bilingual and multilingual societies is not equal across the globe. You have parts of the world that are more monolingual than the others, right? And on an individual level, it is said that two-thirds of the world's children grow up in a bilingual environment. So this is a majority, right? This is why this is an important topic. And it has been an important topic indeed in the field of psycho and neurolinguistics, which is something that I will move to. As you can see, I just added here the covers of three very interesting books on the bilingual brains. Um, it is because our let's say psycholinguistic and neurolinguistic research had been very focused on a one language or on a monolingual setting. But as I just said in the previous slide, that is not the majority of this world, right? So we kind of at some point the researchers realized, well, why are we talking about the brain as something having only one language when the majority of the world has more than one language in the brain? So obviously there are many different models um, that have been proposed about how learning more languages changes your brain. And the researcher that I actually mentioned here, Bialystok, um, I didn't put it on the slide, but this is a very important information. This researcher, although it's a debate, there is a other side that says something different. But this researcher is really a strong proponent of the idea how bilingualism actually makes your brain more efficient, not just in languages, but in other functions. So that you have, consequently, that you have advantages just by the mere fact that you know several languages. And those functions are called the executive functions. That you are more able to monitor the situation, to supervise the situation, and to switch between different tasks when you're bilingual or multilingual, because you get a certain dose of, let's say, flexibility uh, to switch between tasks and to switch from one thing to another when you're multilingual. And lately, they have also been doing studies to see whether multilingualism or bilingualism, having more languages, can somehow have a positive effect on early onsets of, or somehow I cannot say prevent, but have positive effects on diseases such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. The idea there is that by having more languages, you are practicing these neural pathways more, right? Again, it's still a matter of debate whether we are kind of using the same neural network for all of the languages, or we have separate neural networks for two languages. We are still trying to understand it. It is possible, it is probably, most possible that this is determined by the type of bilingualism, because all of these different types, depending on the time, depending on the sequence, depending on the context, will affect how those languages are represented in the brain. So it is really hard to determine this unless we are talking about and limiting ourselves to one particular type and profile of the bilinguals. So it's hard to generalize, let's say, and generally conclude whether the brain has two different pathways or networks of activation for the two languages or not, right? But let's assume that there is at least, and this is assumption of some researchers, that there is a base network of connections for language, and that for the second language you're adding things to it, something like an additional satellite little network, right? It has also been said that the level of proficiency um, might affect the separation of the two networks. However, as we will see now, the separation is never complete. So, in essence, being bilingual means having more than one lexical representation to express the same meaning, right? So when we think about the language is just labels for things, for concepts, right? And language is the system of how to use those labels and combine them, to use the code that other speakers will understand, right? But in essence, it's the label for something that is a concept or for an idea or for a message. It boils down to the same thing. Then, when you have more languages, you have several labels for the same thing, right? When we think of a concept of a cat, and we have to add either a label in Spanish or a label in English to it, that means we have more labels, more lexical representations. Now, the most, let's say, simple, according to Rachmanova, who wrote about this, the most simple or intuitively appealing theory would be, let's assume that that bilinguals have two separate lexicons. We call them a lexicon, something like a mental dictionary of all the items in the languages. But actually, a lot of evidence has shown that this is not like that. That we don't just have two separate lists of words, and then when I want to think in Spanish, I access it. I access the Spanish one. When I want to think in Serbian, I access the Serbian one. Actually, the studies have shown that during language, both comprehension, most of the studies are for comprehension, so reading or listening, but we also have some production studies. What actually happens is that you co-activate both languages, and we have a lot of evidence to that. This happens on the subconscious level usually. Sometimes it's even on the conscious level. Meaning, when I want to say, even if I'm now speaking in English and I'm saying linguistics, probably my word for my label for linguistics in Serbian or Spanish has been activated, right? Although I'm not aware of it. And this has been shown in a lot of different experiments where they show that the other language is somehow being a problem in processing the first languages. I mean, problem. It's creating some sort of effect. So this effect is called this cross-linguistic interaction. They interact with one another at various levels of processing. And I will present here two, let's say, simple models of how we think that the languages in the brain might work. These are proposed by Potter and colleagues in '84. So this is now outdated. But I think they're a good starting point to understand the two most, prevailing um, views on this. So what they propose is that we either have the word association model or the concept mediation model. The word association model is the one presented here. So when we have a concept, such as the fork, we first access our first language, the dominant language, and then through the process of translations, we access the label for it in our other language, right? So when I think of fork and I want to say fork, I will first think of the word in Serbian because that's my mother tongue, translated by the means of translation, access the label fork, and then say it, right? Then on the other hand, we have the concept mediation model that claims that this is not the case, that I'm just directly going to access the word fork without having any access or without having any activation. When I say activation, it doesn't have to be conscious, it can be subconscious, of the word viljuška, which is a word for fork in Serbian. The thing is, between these two models, where's the truth? The truth is usually when you have models, the truth is somewhere in between. It's always like that. The 10 years later, Kroll and Stewart proposed the revised hierarchical models, that added some more knowledge from the studies that we found. That is neither this or that. That probably they're both things. So probably we have direct access to both languages or the 3 or 4 languages that we speak, but probably the links with the first language are somewhat stronger, right? Um, our first language and our dominant language is the strongest one because we acquired it first, or and usually that's the one that we use the most. So there is a matter of the frequency of usage. Usually, those words that you use more frequently will be the first one that you access, that pop up. You know, when you think of a fork, I'm going to first come up with a word that is more used in my vocabulary. So that's usually your first language. And as learners become more proficient, and this is very important, we talk about all these representations, but this can all change throughout a person's life. These things are not fixed, right? I can change my own bilingual or multilingual profile by learning the other language more, or stopping to speak my first language a little bit for a while because I moved to another country, or starting to study at the university in France, and now I have French, so that is now dominant. So your profile is a very flexible living thing, and it changes, right? And this model is also accounting for it. And it says, as learners become more proficient in L2, this conceptual link becomes stronger and stronger. And they begin to develop ability to process L2 words directly. And this is now going back to what I was talking about, the brain and the organization of the languages in the brain. The more proficient you are, theoretically, although we don't have much proof for it yet, theoretically, the two languages will separate more and you will be able to access them more directly. And if this is happening in the early stages of language acquisition, there is even more possibility. But according to this model, the connections for L1 always remain stronger than for L2, unless there's attrition and complete loss. And just to show that this gets really, really complicated nowadays, this is now a model from 2013. We added a lot of knowledge and a lot of studies. It also depends on whether we're talking about word recognition, semantics, whether we're talking about production. But actually, it is not just simple as this. It is actually much more complicated. It depends on whether you're speaking or comprehending, what the task is, because when we do experiments, we do them due to specific tasks. But this is basically what we know until now. So the conclusion is that the study suggests that the language system is permeable, highly permeable across the bilinguals two languages, meaning they are not completely separated. They will always be, even though I can access directly one and the other. And even though I'm a balanced, perfect bilingual, the unicorn bilingual profile, and have them very equally strong, the two languages, there will always be the connection between them. Information about words and grammatical structures will always be activated concurrently in the two languages. This is something that we learned from doing experiments. Again, as I said, this is not a conscious process, but this actually, we know now that this always happens. So our languages are very intermixed. Even while bilinguals are reading text or listening to speech in one language alone, right? So this is what I was saying. We know that when a person reads the word dog, like here, although I am reading dog and understanding dog in the first, I don't know, 200 milliseconds of the word processing, I will have the activation of that word in my other languages, right? So this is just to show that, yes, there is some separation, but it will always be, interchangeable. But the beauty is that we are able to control that, right? So this is this is the I will conclude with again underlining that having more languages is a good thing. It can only be a good thing. And it's a, you know, all these studies, they're trying to show how being multilingual and bilingual actually not just is useful for you, but also increases your cognitive functions, um, makes your brain more, say, flexible or able to switch. This is all great, but this is for me additional value. Just, you know, being able to communicate in several languages is for me a reason enough to be bilingual or multilingual. And this is where I will end today's class. And I thank you all, and I will hopefully have some energy to answer some questions.